atheists, agnostics, long-haired weirdos, short-haired weirdos, vandals, hooligans.
The government, hug the government, love the government, hug the government, love the government, hug the government.
Welcome to The Politics Guys, a place for bipartisan, rational, and civil debate on American politics and policy. I'm Northern Kentucky University political scientist Michael Baranowski. My guest today is Matt Grossman, director of the Institute for Public Policy and Social Research and professor of political science at Michigan State University. Matt was on the show back in 2019 when we talked about his book on public policy change, Artists of the Possible, and he's back today to talk with me about his latest book, co-authored with David Hopkins, Polarized Degrees, How the Diploma Divide and the Culture War Transformed American Politics. Matt Grossman, welcome back.
Thanks. Good to be with you.
You know, I've been following politics pretty closely, really since the late 1980s. And back then I was a Reagan Republican. And during those days, sort of the conventional wisdom was that Democrats were the party of the working man, at least that's the phrase we used back then, working person, but people who didn't have college degrees. So this has obviously changed. Maybe you can talk a little bit about when and how this began to change.
Well, in fact, those images of the parties were pretty firm in every election from the 1950s to the early 2000s. The number one thing people said they liked about the Democratic Party was that it represented working people or the common man. And the number one thing that they said that they disliked about the Republican Party was that it represented the rich or big companies. So it took a while for those perceptions to change the way that they are changing now. There were a couple of different trends. One is the slow loss of white voters without college degrees by the Democrats that really started in the 1970s, went back and forth with presidential elections, but has been on a downward trajectory since then. And then there was the much more recent move of college graduates toward the Democratic Party and away from the Republican Party, which has occurred over the last decade. In addition to that, there's just been a large rise in educational attainment since the 1980s. So college-educated voters really couldn't have been a major constituency of either party back then the way that they are today in the Democratic Party.
And in the book, you call this an educultural realignment. And I think it's an interesting turn of phrase. I'm wondering, though, how significant has this been? Because for me, as a political scientist, and for you too, I'm sure, realignment, that's a big deal. And so how would that compare to, say, something like, for instance, the shift we saw in the South from Democratic to Republican dominance?
Well, it is comparable in some ways in that it's a slow change that occurs over multiple elections that shows up first in presidential elections and then filters down to lower level elections. But it is distinct in that it's nowhere near as large and concentrated geographically of a shift. But of course, they are tied together. That is, the shift of white non-college voters definitely started in the South and moved northward and westward since then. Both were associated with the culturally conservative views of voters moving toward the Republican Party on racial attitudes, of course, but also on gender attitudes and other kinds of cultural conservatism. And both were kind of a slow a move of voters who were out of step with the views of their party toward the party that shared their views more on cultural issues. The reason why we term it as this cultural realignment is it really is a commonly held views among the college educated on these cultural issues that seem to be associated with the moves of both the less educated voters and the more educated voters toward their new parties. Now, most people in both realignments changed. I mean, most people stayed with their existing party. So we're not saying the whole world changed. No one is with their existing party. And a lot of people accepted the views of their party on cultural issues, even if they didn't hold them originally. So we're definitely not saying everyone changed, but there has been a big shift in along the education dimension. And it really has, as your first question pointed out, changed the images of the party in a fundamental way.
I want to get at a little bit about what's maybe behind this correlation between higher education and Democratic support. Now, on the left, a lot of us would like to believe it's because, well, when you learn more, you see certainly that the Democrats are better for the country. But on the right, of course, they'll say, well, you know, how we have these radical professors who are indoctrinating students. I don't know that I entirely buy either of those stories, but what do you think?
Yeah, I don't think either of those stories is correct. To the extent that we can tell if people on the left or in college-educated audiences are, you know, more susceptible to information or less susceptible to incorrect ideological information, we don't really find big effects there. And similarly, we don't find a lot of effects from professors on campus. To the extent that attitudes do change during college, it tends to be more peer effects rather than other students, rather than professors. But there is causal evidence from all over the world that a college education is associated with moving views leftward on cultural issues, but not on economic issues. So we do think that that is, you know, a source of the divide, but not the only one. So it's, you know, in the 2016 election, plenty of people who had not gone to college for 40 years, you know, changed their parties in affiliation with the views of college educated and non-college educated voters. So once you leave college or do not leave college, you enter different social networks, different geographic areas, different occupations, different professions. You're just in a different set of surroundings with a college degree and without in the United States today. And so part of the effect is on things you learn in college, but part of them is just the things that go with college education long after you leave college.
Some people might wonder about the relationship between college education and income and these sort of views, because, of course, there's that well-known connection between getting a degree increases your lifetime's earnings, that sort of thing. And so what happens if you control for that, if you try to take that out of the equation? Do we still see this divide then?
Well, it becomes stronger because if you control for educational attainment, you can still find some effects of income that go in the other direction. So the most Republican people are people with low education but high income, and the most Democratic people are people with high education but low income. So that, you know, yes, they generally are correlated, but there are still people in the diagonals, and those are the people that seem to be moving the most with this change. And it really has made a big difference in the aggregate, because in the 1970s, there was almost no divide between education levels between the parties, and there was a huge divide between income between the parties. And now it's the opposite. There's a big divide by education level and no divide by income overall between the parties. But hiding under that is, you know, these people that are in the off diagonal to that correlation, where they either have a high education despite their low income, or have a low income despite their high education. Those are the people that are moving the most.
And earlier, you sort of alluded to the fact that this isn't just an American phenomenon, is it?
Absolutely not. There is a worldwide trend, several. One, a worldwide increase in educational attainment, worldwide change in the political conflict to be more about cultural issues over time. And both of those have been associated with an increasing education divide between the left and the right in Europe, in Asia, in Latin America, and an increase in the distinctions between educated voters and less educated voters in their views on policy issues. So all of those are global trends across democracies, and they're, of course, visible in the rise of populism. But there's a big difference in the United States. We have a very strict two-party system, the strictest in the world. And that means that things which would occur in third parties in other countries happen within the two parties in the United States. So you might see something like a Green Party or a Liberal Party that takes the votes of those high education voters who might not fully agree with the social democratic parties on economic issues. And then you would see voters take these anti-immigration or populist parties or anti-system parties on the right who have low education, who have culturally conservative views, but may not agree with the traditional center-right parties on economic issues. In the United States, we do not have those outlets. And so instead, they have sort of remade our major parties in the image of what would be third parties in other countries.
Yeah, and that's something that occurred to me because, I mean, you take a look back even as recently as, say, like 2012, and you have Mitt Romney being the Republican nominee. And of course, now he's almost been practically pushed out of the party in essence. And so it pretty clearly, right, that we can see this change, it seems to me, most clearly in the sort of candidates that are nominated by the Republican Party. But I guess probably also someone on the Democratic side as well, right?
Absolutely. There's been a change, and we don't want to downplay the importance of individual actors like Barack Obama and Donald Trump, especially in bringing this about. At the same time, there were precursors to these changes in congressional candidates, in lower level candidates, and in failed presidential candidates in previous primaries. So these constituencies were there to be filled. And the fact that these are worldwide patterns and long-term trends does suggest that although Obama and Trump accelerated these patterns, they were not necessary for them to eventually occur because under the hood, the parties were changing.
And so my sense, at least on the right, is that pretty clear this has resulted in a far more populist Republican Party. But on the left, my feeling is that you get the sense that a lot of nationally prominent Democrats seem somewhat out of step with what we call real Americans and flyover country. That's pushing issues, the sort of issues that you can see as being big on college campuses, like DEI would be one thing, or Palestinians, Gaza, that sort of thing. I mean, is that sort of the flip side of this?
Absolutely. There's been a huge change in the Democratic Party. People, see this change in the Republican Party, but actually the constituencies of the parties have changed far more dramatically in the Democratic Party than the Republican Party. The Republican Party has always been dominated by low education white voters. The voting base of the Democratic Party has changed from being 50% non-college whites to 1/4 non-college whites and falling. And so that really has changed the image of the Democratic Party. And absolutely, the Democratic leaders are moving further left on cultural issues and in the representation of the party than the voter base as a whole, as they are following their college-educated constituencies. And certainly a lot of campus politics have made their way into the way that the Democratic Party is seen by voters. Now, this, of course, has precursors in the 1960s protests, but those were, seen as aberrations, small constituencies. They weren't seen as the leadership of the Democratic Party. And now we're to a pace where it's not just Republican elites that are complaining about college campuses. It's actually even Republican voters who are increasingly seeing themselves as out of step with educated liberals and the institutions that are dominated by them.
I wonder if the reason why we didn't see that sort of a change sort of at the core of the party in the 60s is maybe because of the fact that primaries were not really a big thing at that point. I mean, they were just kind of the start of the modern system of nominations, as well as maybe fundraising sources were different. And so now the candidates sort of have to appeal more to these bases than they did in the past. What do you think about that?
Well, but the base of the Democratic Party was not at all the same. College-educated voters were just an extremely small constituency. They would not have, they wouldn't have been able to win these primaries. And in fact, when the more lefty and campus-affiliated candidates did win, like in 1972, they suffered losses and were blamed. Activists were blamed for those losses. And so the Democratic Party really shied away from any affiliation with campus activists for a long time because of that association. So you really had to have this growth in educational attainment and the increasing association between educational attainment and leadership in all of these social institutions, not just campuses, but nonprofits, the media, even corporations, where college-educated liberals are increasingly reside and have distinct views. And it's only kind of at the point that you get that as a major constituency and as a source of cultural power that you're really able to see, those voters come to their own in controlling Democratic Party outcomes.
At one point in the book, you write that we're essentially, while we are essentially politically deadlocked, more or less, there's this big Democratic cultural advantage. And I think that's pretty obvious when you take a look at the celebrity endorsements, say, for Trump compared to those for Harris. My co-host Jay likes to talk about, Scott Baio, and you got Kid Rock and a few other people, but pretty much the rest of the cultural elite, almost huge Democratic advantage. And why is it that, what's the connection here? I'm sure there is one, between Democrats seeming to control the culture, or at least have somewhat of a stranglehold on it. And how much would you say that matters electorally?
Well, the longstanding associations between people in cultural industries and cultural liberalism have just become more important in an age where our politics are increasingly about social and cultural issues. And the increase in educational attainment across society has just meant that people within these institutions are now overwhelmingly college educated. That includes political institutions. It's 95% of members of Congress have college degrees, 70% have graduate degrees. The same is true across institutions. Even conservative leaning institutions like the military and churches are increasingly college educated. Companies, corporate boardrooms and PR departments and all of those places. But certainly when it comes to Hollywood, the media, any kind of cultural power, you have businesses and organizations that are dominated by college educated people and therefore cultural liberals. And that is making an increasing difference in our society. Now, is it enough to regularly win elections? No, because the power of cultural conservatism is still strong in the electorate, and it can shift. So even as cultural conservatives concede ground, like gay rights, it moves to issues like transgender rights. If they cede ground on drugs, they'll find other issues that animate them. Immigration has become more important on the cultural side. So there is kind of an endless reserve of people who say things are going too fast, they're changing too fast, we need to, go back to traditional American values, even as overall values have shifted to the left pretty dramatically. You can see that on policy positions, but you can also see it in attitudes toward all kinds of social behavior that maybe seem divorced from politics, but obviously make a difference in whether people see that our society is moving in a good direction or not.
Yeah, and I wonder, I think a lot of people probably don't necessarily appreciate how big of a change there's been in the media. I mean, for a long time, being a reporter, being a journalist wasn't really a college-educated, ink-stained wretches kind of thing. And of course, that shifted a whole lot. And then you hear stories about things like the New York Times newsroom and sort of the group of young college-educated progressive activists who's going to be pushing a certain agenda. And I think that, to me, it seems like makes potentially a pretty big difference.
It has made a huge difference. You can see it in the coverage, in the word usage of the media. Importantly, it's global and across media institutions. So it's not a story of any sort of one newsroom. It's a broad story about changes in our cultural institutions. Now, from the perspective of those people, this is nothing but just standing up for our core values, pushing back against discrimination or anti-diversity views. So to them, they're not, intervening in the political world. The political world has become much more about things that, that they thought there should be cultural agreement on. But obviously, from the perspective of conservatives in the electorate, they're increasingly aligned against one half of the American political competition. And, certainly that's become increasingly apparent to people on the right and created increased resistance to all of these social institutions.
And kind of to that point, I seem to recall back in the mid 90s when Newt Gingrich led the Republicans into power after generations out of power. One of the things he really focused on was finding a way to sort of erode trust in these long-term Democratic-controlled institutions, and with the idea being if you can weaken them, then you can make it easier for Republicans to take control. But it seems to me that this ends up becoming a sort of a negative feedback loop, right? When we see now that Republicans have increasingly greater skepticism of almost all big institutions. And I wonder how this fits in with the diploma divide.
Well, it's absolutely connected because Republicans see experts and expert-controlled institutions as being on the liberal side of the political spectrum. That's not their imagination, that there's increasingly an affiliation because experts are the most highly educated people in our society and they have the most culturally liberal attitudes. And it has now made its way down to Republican voters. It isn't just a complaint of Republican elites, but there's a wider distrust in experts and expert-controlled institutions on the right. Now, in terms of policymaking, of course, it's still largely, issue-based experts. If you look at people who are testifying before congressional committees or who are consulted by makers, it obviously is still overwhelmingly extremely highly educated people. So it's very hard to kind of hold this anti-expert view in a policymaking system where it's still going to be dominated by experts. An important sort of piece that we bring is also just that the issues, even seemingly moral issues like guns and abortion, now have long-running policy networks and backgrounds that you have to know. There's a lot of technical information to get into these spheres, much less the kind of leading edge spheres that we look at: public health and COVID, climate change and environmental policy, and higher education itself. So Republicans are up against, institutions that are dominated by college-educated people and their values, and a system of expertise that is dominated by those, and in an era in which our policy issues are increasingly technocratic. So it is a difficult thing to go against, but certainly one that Newt's move against the nonpartisan congressional institutions was an earlier harbinger of.
And this, it seems to me, wouldn't necessarily just be a problem for these liberal-leaning experts. It also potentially could be a problem for Republicans, because once you erode that legitimacy, that trust in the policymaking system and in the institutions that carry out these policies and put in place the regulations and so forth, I got to wonder at some point, what are you left with, and how do you have any sort of a stable environment for policymaking and carrying out policy?
Well, it's true, but it does depend on your goals. A lot of conservatives think that there's too much policymaking, that that there's too much deference to expertise, that there's too many rules that are written. And from those perspectives, reducing the role of experts or the credibility of social institutions or regulators or government can all actually serve your goals and interests. So certainly over the long term, it has wider consequences for trust in governmental institutions and the ability for government to perform its functions. But for the interests of people who believe that those things have already gone too far, it can be in their interest.
Yeah, because at least when I talk to my conservative friends, they'll say, generally speaking, that it's not like they mistrust experts just because they're experts, or institutions just because they're institutions, but they say, well, you have these experts and these institutions that have become essentially what they see as hopelessly compromised and by their liberal progressive ideology. And their goal isn't to destroy the institutions, but their goal is to restore the trust by getting that back to that ideal, which was probably never really realized, of kind of neutral competence. And do you think they have a point in that then?
Well, they certainly have a point in that these institutions are and experts are overwhelmingly college-educated liberals who have distinct values and interests. And of course, expertise is always going to be a combination of greater knowledge, but also distinct values and distinct interests. And those things certainly come together. And conservatives are always going to be able to point to examples of experts who are drawing not just from their greater knowledge, but also from their distinct values and interests. We, of course, saw this play out in the debate over COVID. And we don't want to downplay the examples that conservatives were able to bring. Things like, the public health community coming out in favor of the Black Lives Matter protests after they had just condemned the anti-lockdown protests on public health grounds. Institutions, long after it was shown that surface area was not a big way that the disease was transmitted, spending millions of dollars cleaning up surfaces just to continue to do something. And of course, the big debate over school closure, where all kinds of evidence was brought to bear that didn't, in the end, turn out to be consistent with the expert consensus, but was at the time consistent with the interests of liberal institutions that were deploying them. So that of course, is to say nothing, to not, of course, say that expertise was not valued. There's evidence that many conservative communities actually had higher rates of death after they were more resistant to take up of vaccines. That was, again, because of distrust of experts. So both things are true. It's both true that experts can bring important information and that is important to the success of policymaking. It is also true that experts combine their greater knowledge with their distinct values and interests. And so it's no wonder that conservatives would distrust an expert core that's increasingly college-educated liberals.
Yeah, and it seems to me also that because of this increasing distrust on the conservative side, you get this almost the reflexive reaction on many people on the left being even more supportive of this expertise and unwilling or less willing to consider the fact that experts are sometimes wrong, as they were in a number of instances you kind of pointed out with COVID. And so it becomes, again, kind of a very much a negative feedback sort of thing. At least that's my take on it. Would you agree with that?
Absolutely. And I think, if you step back and you think about the transformation of liberalism, this is the left was not out there, saying, isn't it great that we have the New York Times and Harvard University and, the major government agencies to lead us forward. That used to be far less trust of major institutions on the left. And similarly, it used to be the right who was more about preserving existing institutions. They used to talk about the left as being a threat to those institutions. Now they talk about it more as the left is in control of these hegemonic institutions, and they don't allow our dissent. So that's a real change, but we think that it really does show the shift toward cultural liberalism within these institutions, the success of both educated institutions, educated people, and cultural liberalism, that we've now moved to a point where even the demeanor of these sides vis-a-vis these institutions has almost completely reversed.
It seems like one institution that conservatives, or at least I wouldn't call it an institution necessarily, but conservatives traditionally, while they do not trust big government, they've been fans of the business community and letting the market decide and that sort of thing. But yet we've seen a number of pretty strong conservative interventions actually using government to take on what they would call woke capitalism. I think about, for instance, Ron DeSantis taking on Disney, a hugely important employer in his state. And so can you talk a little bit about how woke capitalism and conservative reaction to that fits into all this?
Absolutely. This is one of the, the sort of craziest manifestations of this change in our politics around this realignment is that, the traditional relationship between business and Republicans is fraying, and even more oddly, the alliances that have developed between educated liberals and corporate America. And it reflects the same kinds of trends within these institutions, big companies, PR departments, HR departments, compliance departments, all of these, and the boardroom itself are increasingly dominated by people who have college degrees. Many of them went to graduate school. Many of them went to elite institutions. Many of them live in areas surrounded by educated liberals. And so, they're all of their influences move in that same direction. They, of course, also have to take account their employees who are increasingly from those same places. They have to take into account their customers, and that may move some companies in different directions. So far, the evidence on wokeness is that companies did change what they say publicly. They did so, especially in areas where they were headquartered in liberal areas. Their employees were more liberal and their bosses were more liberal. And so conservatives are reacting to real change in companies. Now, the companies are in a tough spot because, again, they feel that they're just, standing up for their employees. Their employees say, they don't want to live in a state where, they feel that they're discriminated against. So Disney has to, react to that to some extent. So the companies are responding and are what they see as just upholding what they see as fundamental values. But, they should also recognize that they are not just reflecting social change, but leading social change because of the kinds of people that are within their institutions.
And I would guess this would be the biggest problem for the companies that have the largest divide between their sort of worker base and the base of people they're trying to sell to, essentially.
Yes, there are companies that have that distinction. And many people try to say, I'm going to stay above it. I'm going to focus on, our core competency. But it's a difficult thing to do when everything has become political. And even, hiring, if you hire 100 influencers and one of them is one that conservatives don't like, then it can take down the stock of your company. That's an environment where it's going to be, pretty difficult to not be positioned on one side, of a political debate. But certainly you're going to see the leading edge more in these companies. Disney is full of entertainment industry workers. It's full of people who are the type of people who are moving leftward on cultural issues and college educated. So it's going to be harder for those kinds of companies as well.
Yeah, it's exactly what I was thinking, because thinking that, the executive suite of is it Miller or Bud Light, that company there is going to be very different from the user base, the people who are, buying the beer. And so you see kind of things like we did with that Dylan Mulvaney kind of thing. And, I assume, generally speaking, that social media makes pretty much everything in our society worse. And so I'm assuming it's made this worse as well. Can you talk a little bit about how you feel social media has contributed to this political and culture war, really?
So obviously we're in an era where, every decision by a company, every remark by a public figure, can become a viral moment that we fight about. And it also just means that, popular culture has always had political influence, but now it is just kind of in your face all the time. So if it is a way for conservatives to see that they are distinct from an educated class of people, then it's going to be, more prominent. Conservatives also always had, examples to point to, but it just didn't seem so prominent and it wasn't so easily spread. So if you look at transcripts of Rush Limbaugh in the 1990s, a lot of it is about crazy things happening on campus, examples of lefty politics, but those were not as easy to find and not as easy to spread. And now, there's examples every single day. If you want an example of an expert that is imposing their values rather than their knowledge base, you're certainly going to find it. If you want an example of an institution that should be independent, that's instead taking on Republican politicians and taking lefty positions, it's easy to find that. And the left is, of course, also fighting back. So any time that, you see the right doing something, it's just easy to do outrage politics now. And that makes, all of our polarization self-reinforcing.
And it's striking to me how recent so much of this feels. And maybe there's a lag effect, but I often think back during presidential election season, my least favorite time every 4 years. But, as recently as 2008, you had GOP nominee John McCain telling his fellow Republicans that you don't have to be scared about Barack Obama. He's a decent American who, loves his country, a good family man. They just happen to disagree about issues. I can't end up, my wildest imagination, imagine Kamala Harris or Donald Trump certainly saying anything like that. I mean, it feels like it's these trends, right, have been building for a long time, but it just sure seems to have exploded in the last, 2 or 3 presidential elections.
It is true that they've accelerated recently. It's also true that I definitely tell my students about 2008 that as recently as 2008, a lot of people liked both presidential candidates, which seems so foreign to us now, but they did have majority support in 2008. I don't want to fully exonerate our politics from 2008. A lot of it was about Obama's pastor in Chicago. It was about Obama's ties to a Weather Underground figure. There was strong, and of course, about racial attitudes. So there was a strong cultural trends that were kind of under the surface that, McCain was not willing to egg on. So credit to him for that, certainly. But that doesn't necessarily mean that, they weren't building under the hood. And you can also see some of these trends in congressional politics. So, for example, people think of Trump as kind of bringing anti-immigration politics to the Republican Party, but it was really the Republican presidents that were oddballs in that issue. The Republicans in Congress had been moving against immigration for 40 years before Donald Trump, and Democrats had been increasingly moving in favor of immigration fairly dramatically in Congress as well. So, some things, if we just have one presidential election every 4 years, we're going to see dramatic change, where maybe if we look more widely at the political system, you can see it building over time.
There are a lot of old school Republicans that I know, including Jay, my co-host on the show. They have this belief, or they have this hope, I'll call it, that Donald Trump is sort of an aberration, and that kind of angry populism that he's so good at isn't going to carry over, and it's going to be just a blip. And they'll sometimes say, well, look what happens when Ron DeSantis tried it. He flamed out super quickly. But my sense from, if you're right about these cultural things and educational things driving it, I would think that they would probably be wrong about that. But what do you think?
Well, I certainly am open to some things being Trump specific. So, for example, attitudes toward elections and democratic institutions, if they're not going to be egged on by future Republican candidates, then we may see some trends backward. And some things are under the control of the campaign. So worldwide, these trends are much more pronounced in places where the parties have talked more about cultural issues relative to economic issues. So if the parties start talking more about economic issues, maybe because there's a recession, and less about cultural issues, then that might make a difference. And we had an example in 2012, actually, both candidates decided to talk more about economic issues. Romney thought he had an advantage because the economy hadn't fully recovered under Barack Obama, and Obama thought he had an advantage because of portraying Romney as a factory closer and a hedge fund guy. And so the campaign was actually much more about economic policy in its ads and statements, and that did make a difference. So is it going to shift the long-term trajectories? Probably not. Given that this is worldwide, it's a multi-decade pattern. It's very unlikely that you're going to see a huge reversal of the education divide. Instead, what we're seeing is kind of an extension. So the education divide, of course, is much more pronounced among white voters, but it is making its way to minority voters. And there are signs that this election, that it will continue to do so. And it's kind of, made people, it seemed odd to people that an election where we have Donald Trump again, we would have movement of like Hispanic voters towards Trump last time, Black voters towards Trump this time, especially an election where now we have Kamala Harris on the Democratic side. But I think I think you get confused if you see everything as under the discretion of the presidential candidates. Then it doesn't necessarily make that much sense that you would see those shifts. But if you see it as, long-term shifts, which first happened among some constituencies and are working their way toward in other constituencies, then it becomes seen as a lot more inevitable, especially given that it's occurring across democratic nations.
It just occurred to me that for a long time, at least some folks in the conservative movement have argued that what we need as conservatives is, given the fact that these institutions have been so compromised, we need to create our own institutions. And I would argue that since the 80s or so, they've been successful in doing that in a lot of ways on the kind of policy think tank end of things. But where they've been maybe less successful is those educational institutions that might help to rebalance, I guess you could say that. Now, you could argue maybe the homeschooling movement is part of that. But also in recent years, you've seen some conservatives talk about creating their own higher education institutions. I think Donald Trump called for like a national university. There's this university that started in, I want to say, Texas or something like that. But my sense of things is, while I get what conservatives are trying to do there, I don't know that it's going to have that much of an impact, though maybe it will if those institutions become kind of elite filters for conservative expertise. I don't know. Like I said, this just occurred to me. What do you think about that?
Yeah, they're up against a lot. They're correct that these institutions are controlled by college-educated liberals and that they're going to be hard to shift. Now, that is a change from how conservatives approached them before. Again, they thought that you could protect the traditional part of the institution against its threats from these extreme liberals when they talked about it in the 1980s. Today, they don't talk about it like that. They talk about it as they're being controlled and lost. And so, the only strategy is to create these alternative institutions. But yeah, if you think that you're going to, remake American higher education by taking over a couple of small colleges in Florida, working from Hillsdale and, the University of Austin in an office building, even conservative state legislatures successfully building, some new pieces of major state universities, it's still a very long slog to get back to, any kind of conservative influence within these institutions. And, they're up against these tides that they themselves are recognized. So yes, they are trying. I agree that in some places they've made better inroads. The biggest one is in the judiciary. In the judiciary, we have political appointments. And so, the conservatives can, control which people are within those institutions. They also successfully, created law and economics programs. They financed foundations. They recruited people. They had organizations for networking in the Federalist Society. They had all kinds of institutions to really try to build a conservative elite within law schools. But honestly, the main thing that worked is just affirmative action for conservatives. There's evidence that if you go to an elite law school and you are willing to clerk for a conservative judge, your chances are pretty high of getting like a major clerkship. And it's, 30 or 40 times as high as if you're a liberal trying to get those clerkships. So, that is really the strategy that has worked is, direct political influence on these institutions, not necessarily building all these counter institutions.
There's this saying, I think it's largely true too, that politics is downstream of culture. And I think a lot of us on the left may be yearning for those days of congressional total dominance and that sort of thing. Think, well, what this means, therefore, is that we just kind of have to hold on and deal with these sort of last gasp of these bitter clingers, as Barack Obama famously called them. And then we're going to be okay, the coming Democratic majority, which never actually seems to get here, but I mean, what do you base this, given that you've thought about these things and looked at these cultural advantage that Democrats have, do you think this translates into a long-term political advantage, or certainly Republicans don't stand still in the face of this? How do you see this playing out, say, in the medium term? I don't know, the next, say, 5 to 10 years.
It definitely doesn't create an electoral advantage. It does create a policy advantage. Liberals should celebrate all of the successes that they have had in moving the culture leftward that has resulted in real policy change. Our policies on gay rights, on women, on drugs, on entertainment, on all kinds of different areas, are moving leftward. And even where, the Democrats lose, they end up, making a difference, like on the abortion decision, there you really did have an electoral advantage for the Democrats. You also had a whole bunch of states actually move their policies further leftward than they were before the decision. So, there are real wins on the Democratic side, and even the losses are successfully counteracted. But we should not expect those to be associated with an electoral advantage for the Democratic Party. First, as you know, public opinion moves against the direction of policy, not in its favor. Public opinion, the elections also tend to move against fundamental policy change, not in its favor. So when you win on policy, you often lose electorally from thermostatic reaction to policy change. And, second, the cultural conservatism is resilient. It can react to ceding a lot of ground, but finding new examples of things going too far, of society changing too fast. And so there's going to be reserve of cultural conservatism, even if they change their opinions on particular policy issues, or even if they accept some social change as it is codified. So yes, liberals can win on policy from winning on culture. And absolutely, we agree that politics is in many ways downstream from culture. And that is why we've had some of these big political and electoral changes. But no, winning on culture does not mean winning regular elections.
And, I got to say that I thought I knew a lot about educational attainment and partisan differences going in, but I learned so much more from reading Polarized Degrees. It's a great book, and I'm just really happy that we had a chance to talk about it. So thanks so much for taking the time to come on and talk with me today, Matt.
Thank you. We appreciate it.
Thanks for listening to this Politics Guys interview. If you're not already a supporter of the show, I hope you'll consider becoming one, because without our supporters, we wouldn't be able to do this. And when you become a supporter, you get not just that warm, fuzzy feeling knowing that you're supporting a good cause. I like to think we're a good cause, but you also get stuff like ad-free versions of everything we put out. You get our supporter exclusive midweek show, the full length of that, not just the preview. And you also get to be part of our Discord group if you want. And there's always some interesting conversations going on there. At the $10 a month level or more, you get to actually be part of the episodes Jay and I do, if that's something you're interested in. So there's a lot of stuff, is what I am saying. And I hope you'll consider checking it out. And to do that, just go to patreon.com/politicsguys. If you want to support us on Venmo, we're at Politics Guys. You can also support the show through PayPal. And all of our support links are always in the show notes, as well as at politicsguys.com/support. And as always, I want to close with a very special thank you to our wonderful executive producers, Bruce Johnson, Wilma Moreno, Daniel Toe, Ryan Beasley, and Don Oglesby.
This podcast is part of the Democracy Group,